I really appreciate the fact that we managed to subvert the process and begin the process of communication before the introductions.
That's very good. That's very Byzantine, you know.
And that's was going to be my comment. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's installment of the Yephira Speaker Series, a collaboration between the SNF Center for Hellenic Studies at Simon Fraser University and the SNF Center for the Study of Hellenic Culture at UCLA. My name is Dimitris Krallis, and in my capacity as director of the SNF Center for Hellenic Studies at SFU and as a Byzantinist, I will be responsible for introducing our speaker and moderating today's talk, though from all the evidence I have, I don't think moderation is really necessary.
I think it will be. In the old sense of moderation, yes. Believe me.
So, before we begin, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that this event is taking place at Simon Fraser University's Vancouver campus on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. Now, I'm truly thrilled to present our speaker, Dr. Panagiotis Agapitos, the Gutenberg Distinguished Research Fellow in Byzantine Literature at the University of Mainz. Dr. Agapitos encountered Byzantine studies, Byzantine art history, and musicology south of where he lives today at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, where he completed his undergraduate studies, only to continue with graduate degrees in classical and Byzantine philology at Harvard University, where he obtained his MA and PhD. After that, Dr. Agapitos taught for 25 years at the University of Cyprus as professor of Byzantine literature and culture in the Department of Byzantine and Modern Greek Studies. His research interests focus on textual and literary criticism with an emphasis on Byzantine rhetoric, poetics, erotic fiction, and the representation of death in Byzantine literature. He has published some 80 scholarly works, 3 monographs, and several edited volumes. I can assure you that he can spin a tale of a single manuscript as if it is a mystery novel, which of course brings us to today's talk, precisely focused on his work on Byzantine crime novels. As a fan of crime procedurals and noir, from Conan Doyle to Chandler, Chester Himes, Walter Mosley, and Elroy, as someone who has always wondered if Echoes the Name of the Rose could ever be set in the world I study, Byzantium, I'm delighted to be introducing a Greek author who did much to answer these questions of mine with his elegant crime novels. And without further ado, I introduce Dr. Agapitos.
Thank you. First of all, do you hear me all? Great, okay. Because, you know, technology is of the devil. Like we're talking here as Byzantinists, okay? So we try to avoid it as much as possible. So it's a great pleasure to be here. It's the first time I come to Vancouver. I have never been to the west coast of Canada, though I have visited Toronto and Montreal 150 years ago when I was a graduate student at Harvard. So Dimitris asked me to talk a little bit about my crime novels and their connection, the connection or the difficulties that one has to deal with fiction when fiction is anchored in history. What is the problem there and what are the difficulties? And in order to do so, I will talk not only about my own work, but I will also talk a little bit about the genre of crime fiction, because we need to have a general picture of this and then talk about my novels. So let me start by saying that we usually tend to view the writing of history as an objective process that is supported by substantial and varied written documentation, okay? Accounts, documents, memoirs, newspapers, archival material, laws, treaties, statistical information, but also other types of evidence, such as archaeological findings and oral testimonies. The interpretation and synthesis of all of this material is conducted usually again, by a clearly defined method or a combination of methods that the writers actually explain to their readers, usually in their works. Contrastively, the writing of fiction is perceived as a subjective process of imaginative creation, following different sets of practices and conventions within the various, mostly prose genres authors wish to explore. No evidence or any scientific methods support the fictional story, while the readers accept fictionality as a contract of make-believe between them and the author. So it is an essential part of fiction that the readers or the listeners of a story accept the fact that the story is fictional, but they believe in it during the actual process of reading or listening. Okay? This is the make-believe contract. Historical fiction, however, poses a problem because fictionality now is transferred to a past that is in advance perceived by the readers as real. The Byzantine Empire, for example, you have a famous here representation from a 9th century psalter with the iconoclasts fighting the icons are actually whitewashing the painting of Christ. Right? But on the other hand, we have a typical medievalist representation from an Ivanhoe, famous Ivanhoe film of 1952 with George Sanders, Elizabeth Taylor in the center, and Guy, what's his name, Rolfe, as the bad prince John, where there is an attempt, right, made to pay some attention to the exactitude of this representation so that it looks somehow medieval or whatever. And this can be the clothing, props, the settings, even landscapes, and also to character drawing, especially if historical persons are included in such a story set in the past, given that people, or at least that's what we believe, spoke and behaved differently in the early 19th or the late 16th century than they do today. The further back in time a fictional plot moves, the more is the use of archaeology necessary, because written documentation decreases in volume. You have much more documentary evidence for the history of the First World War than you have about the Peloponnesian War in the middle of the 5th century BC. However, writers of historical novels are not scholars who specialize in the period in which the plot of their novel is situated, but professional authors who mostly use secondary sources for their knowledge of the past. That means that their understanding of the past is a reflection of their secondary sources. Okay? Within this context now, historical crime fiction is a peculiar case. The reason for its peculiarity lies to a certain extent in the history of the crime novel as a genre. After its invention in the late 19th century, crime fiction became one of the most popular and literally cheap stories to be read. It was published by not established publishing houses. It could be bought in newspaper stands, and the books were printed on very cheap material, bad quality paper, and so on. In contrast to any other prose genre, authors and critics started publishing in the 1920s rules on how to write a mystery story. It's something that did not exist. You know, the 20 basic rules for writing a good mystery novel. And people, both the writers, the readers, the critics, knew these rules. They were published in literary journals, they were discussed. By the 1930s, 3 distinct types of plots had developed in crime fiction. The British cozy mystery, as it is called, the American hard-boiled crime novel, and the French police procedural. These works were not considered to be part of the literary establishment proper, but as W.H. Auden, famous poet and critic, pointed out in his highly influential essay with the ironic title, The Guilty Vicarage, in 1948, mystery novels were an escape from literature. You read them in order to get away from serious literature. They were not really literature. And they were written with extremely pronounced conventions that readers knew about. Let me point out to some of these conventions because they are of some importance for understanding the ambivalent relation between history and fiction. A central convention is that the detective is alone and with no family ties whatsoever. He is mostly depicted as an eccentric and sometimes cultured genius, like Sherlock Holmes, of course, or Hercule Poirot, or as an experienced man about town who walks the streets, like Philip Marlowe, the detective of Raymond Chandler. In both cases, he is a private investigator. Right? So he's someone who is outside the police system and the state structure. Or sometimes, especially in initially the French novels, he is an intelligent and perceptive representative of the middle class working in the police, like Inspector Maigret of Georges Simenon. The detective might get involved in an amorous, sometimes fatal affair during the development of the story, and that is from where also in French the term femme fatale appears, because she is the fatal woman that creates death for the people around her. And the detective usually operates in a fixed spatial or social environment. He doesn't move outside this environment. Moreover, his own psychological persona is equally fixed and unchanging. Sherlock Holmes or Hercule Poirot, for 30 years that their authors write their novels, are identical. You recognize them as such, and they don't change internally at all. Another convention is that the central crime of the plot either has a very staged character, literally staged, as in the British murder mystery. A corpse is discovered, and we do not see any violence or any activity around the murder. It's just the body, and that is seen for a moment, and then it is removed. Or it appears, the crime, to be almost coincidental. It just seems to happen, as in the American crime story. The detection of the crime is based on 2 kinds of fictional logic. That of the crossword riddle and its complex evidence in the British type, so that there are massive little pieces of evidence that the intelligent and genius-like detective gets together and then discovers that in the 3rd flower pot, one of the flowers was bent in the wrong way, and that's why the butler then is the murderer. Or that of the improvised narrative, a narrative that appears to look as if it is stream type of writing, and its haphazard ramifications in the American type. There's a famous story of Raymond Chandler when John Huston was working on the adaptation of Chandler's first novel, The Big Sleep, into a movie with Bogart and Lorraine Bacall, and he sent a message to Raymond Chandler asking him, so why exactly does this happen in this scene? And Chandler wrote to him, I have no idea. Yeah. From the perspective of publishers, literary writing, or whatever was then in the 30s and the 40s perceived as such, is excluded. You do not write by using any kind of artistic form of prose. It has to be simple, clean-cut, straightforward, and it can be used and written by anyone. These conventions were paradigmatically codified in the works of Arthur Conan Doyle and Agatha Christie, Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler, and Georges Simenon before the end of the Second World War. By the early 1950s, the conventions were being partially abandoned or consciously subverted, so certain things were happening that made the texts change. And authors with a demanding way of writing begin to make their presence felt, like, for example, Patricia Highsmith, who is seen by many people as a crime writer, but when you actually read the tales of Mr. Ripley, you realize that something completely different is taking place there. In the 1970s, this experimentation expanded even further so that crime fiction began to be accepted by the literary establishment, and crime writers started to be promoted by acclaimed publishing houses, to the point that the famous British crime writer P.D. James, later known as Baroness Phyllis Dorothy James, who was the house author of Faber and Faber, the publisher of, among others, of T.S. Eliot, so you realize at what level we are talking now, wrote a novel in 1994 with the title Original Sin that is set in her publishing house. James not only has her detective, who is the famous chief inspector and poet Adam Dalglish, discuss the genre of crime fiction. So in the crime story itself, the genre is being discussed by the detective police officer, but she, James, also parodies herself as a naive crime writer who falls victim to the murderer. In these new novels, now written by authors in many different countries and languages, the role of the detective ceases to be clear-cut. Good and evil, in quotation marks, lose their well-defined borders and begin to mix. Style becomes much more individual, so that you read and recognize that this is by the author X and this is by the author Y. The characters take on a psychological depth. Violence is vividly represented, while sex is openly acted out. You're actually reading sex scenes, something inconceivable in the 1930s or 40s. Most importantly, female detectives make their appearance, particularly as police officers, thus offering the possibility of negotiating gender roles in a gendered world like that of the police force. In the late 1970s, whoops, yep. In the late 1970s, history made a remarkable appearance on the crime scene when Ellis Peters, and that is the pen name of Edith Pargeter, published in 1977 her first novel with the Benedictine monk Cadfael, who is a monk, a former crusader, and a herbalist, as the detective in the city of Shrewsbury of the 1130s, so the, let's say, early 12th century. It is a typical British cozy mystery with many elements of the idealized English Middle Ages. The immense success of the Cadfael Chronicles and its 21 volumes catapulted on the international stage of crime fiction an impressive production of historical crime novels, primarily British, but also Irish, French, Italian, German, and Russian. And I have here, a selection of titles from Ellis Peters, Paul Doherty, who writes novels in the 13th century, the Marc Paillet, French writer who wrote crime novels set in the early 9th century, and then two Roman historical novels, an Italian one, very famous Italian writer, and an also very famous British writer, Lindsay Davis. The fact that a Dutch writer, Robert van Gulik, and that's the last title that I've put there, who happened to be a scholar of ancient Chinese legal history and the history of sexuality in China, and at the same time, he was ambassador of the Netherlands to China and Japan, had published in the late 1950s and until 1967 12 novels with Judge Dee as the detective set in 7th century Tang China to immense success, has been forgotten in the history of historical crime fiction. But Van Gulik's novels do not fit the generic models of British or American or French crime fiction, and have therefore not received the critical attention they deserve. They do something very different. This neglect, however, shows exactly the difficulty in approaching history within a highly standardized genre and the respective expectations of readers and critics about what they consider to be a good crime novel, because history can be strongly refracted through conventions and assumptions in literature, art, and scholarship. And that's how you get exactly what is now called the medievalist image of the Middle Ages, like in the Ivanhoe film or many other films, where all the characters are astonishingly clean and extremely well kempt. Both things that you didn't really get in the Middle Ages, okay? Let us look then at what happens when a professional Byzantinist wants to write a crime novel set in 9th century Byzantium. For one thing, no police or crime detection existed in Byzantium, nor was there any literary tradition of narratives concerning crime and institutional justice, as, for example, in medieval China. The conventions of the modern mystery genre have to be transferred to a world foreign to the sociocultural environment in which the genre was created. A simple mechanical transposition, as for many medievalist crime novels, will not function, because it imports to a pre-modern historical period and its very, very different mentalities, notions so modern that they cancel the historicity of the plot setting. See, you basically have a very modern plot with medieval costumes. Especially in the cozy version, the remote past appears as a tame, two-dimensional representation of an exotic setting, or it becomes an exaggerated, equally two-dimensional burlesque, a very humorous kind of narrative that recreates a distorted modern image of that specific past, as exactly in the Roman novels of Lindsay Davis, where the characters, and we are talking about Rome in the 1st century AD, okay, the characters act and speak as if they were in a Chandler novel. There's a favorite scene of mine where the detective and another guy are sitting in a Roman tavern, and it's like as if you were in a pub in Los Angeles of 1940, okay? And it is consciously made. I mean, this is a conscious kind of act. So to these basic conventions of the traditional genre, I tried to find a version that would reflect some equivalent Byzantine practice in order to begin to bring fiction and history closer to each other. So in The Ebony Lute, which is my first novel, the Protospatharios Leo, and Protospatharios is his court title, which means senior sword bearer, but he doesn't carry swords, and he is the detective to be, is 30 years old and fictively born on 15 September 800, because I wanted him to be a Virgo as a zodiac sign, and the reason is that all of my characters are clearly defined astrologically. The reason being that Byzantines very strongly believed in character formation through the stars and the zodiac signs, and therefore, when a character acts and speaks in a particular way, another person may very well understand what zodiac sign that person is. And this is a way of understanding psychological behavior before the invention of psychology. Okay? So Leo lives alone in his house with his trusted old servant in Constantinople. He is a learned high-class gentleman who plays plucked instruments and owns a luxurious Arab ebony lute, while he is a dedicated reader of the ancient Greek erotic novels, as many Byzantines were, in fact. He comes from a family of judges and heads as senior secretary, and that's his job. He is a proto-asikritis, the imperial chancellery under the young emperor Theophilos, who reigned from 829. He was 16 years old when he ascended the throne and died equally very young in 842. Leo did not marry. He is alone. The reason is, as we discover, because he was forced by his father to take up a position in the Ministry of the Interior, the Logothesion to Dromou, and the reason, the fictive reason, is that his older brother died, and so the younger brother needs to take up this job. But primarily because Leo was rejected by the woman he had fallen in love with when both of them were 16 and studied together in the same, under the same teacher. And so Leo, when we meet him, still suffers very pathetically in the manner of the heroes in the Greek romances that he reads. So see, he identifies himself with these suffering young lovers of antiquity. All of this allows the convention of the lonely detective now to function in a Byzantine context. However, Leo's bachelorhood is viewed as strange by various characters in the novels in order to make readers aware that this is not a common Byzantine practice. A man that was unmarried and was not a monk is a strange thing in Byzantine culture. But this situation also creates, as the novels progress, the suspenseful question for the readers if Leo will find the right woman for him. Okay? So for the plot, I chose the second period of the iconoclastic controversy, that is the 30 years from the accession of Leo the Armenian in 813 until the death of Theophilos in 842. This is a period of Byzantine history practically unknown to the broader public in Greece, let alone elsewhere. It is not taught in the schools, and no one knows anything about it. However, it is an age of social and administrative changes, a period where important reforms in the judicial system were taking place, and where Emperor Theophilos himself insisted on justice as a major component in the proper function of society, to the effect that although the emperor was an iconoclast, in later memory, so in the 10th, in the 11th century, he was remembered for being an emperor who was just and insisted on the dispensation of justice. The early 9th century was also a period of scholarly and literary renewal, of experimentation, and particularly of confrontation with the scientific and cultural achievements of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, the Muslim superpower fighting with Byzantium as the Christian superpower in the Middle East. And you have this wonderful depiction here that I have used as my inspiration, because it is exactly Emperor Theophilos giving a letter to an ambassador who then moves like in a cartoon and reaches Baghdad and gives the letter to the famous or infamous Caliph al-Mamun, who was one of the big warrior caliphs of the early 9th century, and who invaded very often and destroyed partly the lands of the empire in Anatolia. Furthermore, it was also the time of an important theological debate about the character of icons. That is, the painted depictions of divine and holy figures, such as Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints. This debate played a very important role in the understanding and function of the visual arts within Byzantine society. What does it mean to depict a saint? Can a saint be depicted? Can Christ be depicted? And if so, why? And also, why should a painted image, which is not real, but it is handmade, be adored and venerated? Can this be a case of idolatry? Right? These were issues that were being very strongly debated as the production of art grew and grew in importance, both for the church and for people, and for private, in particular, private piety. People having icons in their houses, and even having small icons or all kinds of little objects that they kept with them as amulets and protecting themselves. Therefore, an intelligent, juridically educated and cultured man of mildly iconoclast, and that is innovative beliefs, around the year 830, would be able to view a criminal act and its social context as an intellectual problem. to be solved on many different levels, and we have at least two historical persons of this time that operated in this way, Leo the philosopher and John the grammarian, both of whom lived in the first half of the 9th century, and whose combined biographical profile or character profile is partly reflected in Leo the Protospatharios. Moreover, to make the crime fit into a broader context and not just be something that is abstractly conducted to solve the riddle, I drew political history into the plot by making Leo an ambassador, an emissary, who is sent by the emperor to different kinds of tricky political and diplomatic missions. So Leo travels around the empire. In the British cozy mystery, the space of crime is usually a well-defined setting, and I'm sure you can remember endless examples, like a house in the countryside, a boat, a train, or even a summer resort, a beach. The actual setting is more or less irrelevant as long as it offers the framework for solving the puzzle-like murder, namely to have in one enclosed space many suspects. And the detective needs to play around with all of these suspects. The classic example is Agatha Christie's Murder in the Orient Express. It's a wonderfully written and very classical example of this kind of enclosed space situation. In the American hard-boiled crime novels, the plot is set in an urban landscape. In other words, the city itself is the space of crime. And if you remember, and that's very interesting for how history functions in crime fiction, Raymond Chandler placed his 8 novels with Philip Marlowe in Los Angeles, and that was in his own time. The novels are acted out literally and really in the 1940s and the 1950s. But then later on, 2 other American crime writers, Walter Mosley and James Ellroy, used that Los Angeles of Raymond Chandler to create a different, historically interpreted city. Walter Mosley creating the black Los Angeles of the 50s and early 60s, and James Ellroy, the white, deconstructed, brutal Los Angeles of the very same time, right? But they were not anymore writing in their own time. They're using, this is now Los Angeles that is turned into a historical city that needs to be reconstructed. And it's very interesting to see 2 contemporary authors doing that and bringing out a totally different city in their 2 novels. So it's only the French crime novels that are actually more flexible in their use of space. So you will find the detective going to the provinces, doing all kinds of things, although at the very end, they are mostly set in Paris, but in various sections of Paris and different situations. Contrastively, I use each time a different setting. And theoretically, I could have used Constantinople as the urban space of crime. And it would work because Constantinople was the largest city of the Western world up to the 12th century. But modern historical literary works, as well as scholarship about Byzantium, focus to an excessive degree on Constantinople, equating the capital with the empire itself, not unsimilar, if you think, to Paris. that in popular imagination is equated to France. And I need only to refer to Emily in Paris to bring this particularly constructed image of Paris into our minds. So the removal of the setting from the Byzantine capital and its continuous change allows me to present the readers with different socio-political, cultural, and even ethnic situations within the empire from a close-up perspective. So the ebony lute, for example, is acted out in, let's see, will this work? Whoops. Yeah. Yes. So the ebony lute is acted out in Cappadocian Caesarea, right? The city where Saint Basil the Great was bishop in the 4th century. And that is at the borders with the Abbasid Caliphate of Baghdad. The bronze eye takes place in Macedonian Thessaloniki. It's my own personal tribute to my wife, who is from Thessaloniki. And I wanted to explore a little bit my own experience as an Athenian in Thessaloniki, so that, and how Thessalonians view Athenians. And so a number of characters in the novel actually talk about Leo in the way that friends of my wife talked about me when they first met me. So that was quite interesting as an experience for me and for them. And the third novel is set on the little island of Skiros in the middle of the Aegean Sea. All three at different points. This is in May. This is in a very cold, typical Thessalonian January, and in Skiros is at the beginning of the autumn with the early storms of the Aegean Sea. So Leo is forced, literally, to travel as the emperor's emissary, and he dislikes it profoundly, and he expresses this dislike. And this is like many Byzantines did. They hated traveling. And in general, travel was not an easy thing in the medieval world. It was dangerous, there were robbers, ships went into storms and sank. It was not an easy thing. It took a very long time to reach any kind of place. So Leo, on account of this, is a stranger to each new place, someone who looks at the setting from the outside and who has to fight his way through the local community, sometimes against the local community, and the specific mentalities of its members. Each setting brings with it particular difficulties, and it is archaeological research that helps draw a close-up image of this setting. So let's take, for example, the bronze eye. Oops, here. The substantial archaeological work done over the past century in Thessaloniki allowed me to reconstruct in broad outlines the environs of the city in the Byzantine shape of the river bank of Axios, the river Axios or Vardaris, and the coastline of the Thermaikos Gulf. So I went and looked for an official map, not just a simple geographic map, and I went to the Greek Ministry of Defense to get the official and formal and accessible Greek military maps of the 1950s. So that is what you get, and you can see here the river has, the riverbed has been completely reshaped in order to help the cultivation of the fields. Archaeological research has shown us that the actual river was different and that the coastline was completely different. So this is the coastline and the situation where, Leo finds himself in Thessaloniki. and didn't I say that they are of the devil? Yeah, I firmly believe in this. And you can see, in contrast to modern Thessaloniki, that has a very big urban surrounding landscape, medieval Thessaloniki is a pretty small town in the Thermaic Gulf, completely enclosed by its walls. So furthermore, archaeology helped me, and of course not only archaeology, but my archaeologist friends, whom I dragged to the city through various, and they were asking what was here and give me the references and show me all kinds of things, helped to reconstruct in greater detail the various places within the Byzantine town where the action of the bronze eye takes place. So here you have the area where the remnants of the old imperial palace of Diocletian was to be found, and this, where the number 30 is, what today is the Platia Navarino in Thessaloniki, and this octagonal building was part of this palace, and this was actually the hippodrome here. And number 31 is where the emissaries of the emperor had a house where they stayed when they visited the town. So through the reconstruction, you can actually see exactly what was the original Byzantine part. In the blue line here is the sea wall, and that was all sea. This did not exist, right? So it was the famous Tsimiski Street was the line where actually the small military harbor of the city was placed, and these are the remnants of the palace. Here is the octagon, and here is the house of the emissaries, and that here in the back, that is the Platia Navarino. As a result, quite a few Thessalonian readers took walks to identify at exactly what spot the buildings or marketplaces were situated, and which, to their pleasure, they succeeded in discovering. And I know that because people found me on the internet and wrote me their experiences in emails. Like, said, oh, now I know where you put this and that, and thank you, I'm rediscovering my town. So setting is for me essential to the extent that in the enamel Medusa that takes place in Skyros, it is the island itself and its various landscapes that provide the connection of history with the imaginary plot, because in contrast to other novels, in Skyros, no historical personality actually appears. There's no historical person appearing in the novel. All of the characters of the enamel Medusa are fictional characters. So, while working on the plot of the Ebony Lute, I started sketching Leo's fictional life in relative detail to draw the outline of a series of 5 novels in which we follow the detective and see the development of his life. I decided to have his psychological persona deepen emotionally and mature intellectually. So he's not your typical detective that remains unchanged throughout. And this change takes place gradually as he discovers for himself, and primarily through his mistakes, the mechanisms of crime fiction. So he makes mistakes, and he realizes that he has taken the wrong decisions or has done the wrong things, and then tries to fix them. And this, the correction, the fixing, is a process that involves critical self-reflection. Leo looks into himself as a character. In this way, I could explore what many Byzantines perceived, and which we as modern let's say, amateur connoisseurs of Byzantium do not know at all, perceived as a clash between a person's inner and outer self. Or, to put it in our modern terminology, between an individual's private sphere and the various public roles that individuals play in their everyday lives, you know. Leo engages with this dilemma of finding his true self as what he thinks would be his true self, as he is confronted with situations and emotions outside the protected world of his aristocratic household and of his high office in the imperial chancellery, which means he goes out into the street and sees the mud and dirt. To a certain extent, it is through music and the various plucked instruments that he plays that he gradually discovers, and at the beginning reluctantly, accepts the darker side of his psyche and the rejected desires of his body. In other words, his artistic personality, which he suppresses. This process helps him, even if in a painful way, to understand the crime he each time is faced with and to apply justice in a manner appropriate to that crime and its motives, even if sometimes contrary to the letter of the law. So instead of following the book, he takes another decision about how to dispense justice. And this brings us to the central issue of crime. In the older forms of the genre, the crime committed was rarely depicted in action, and certainly not in a raw manner, while it never violated the broader order of society. Sometimes it did disturb some part of this order, more so in the American and Central European versions than in the old British ones, but it never criticized the status quo in its entirety. Crime novels, especially since the 1980s, have questioned this conformist attitude and have placed crime in a broader context of societal disorder and institutional corruption. On the one hand, character as a formative element of crime becomes of secondary importance in this new version of crime fiction, because crime is a societal and not a personal issue. On the other hand, narrative now allots much more space to the depiction of violence and sex, while it has become far more cinematic in its use of an action-packed plot and related description techniques. You will read novels where you actually see a crime executed in action, people dying literally by being shot and their brains and eyes are exploded, or their intestines are cut and chopped up, and you will have some hot and steamy sex scenes taking place, sometimes by the detective and the femme fatale or other characters in the novel, and you think, oh, wow, what am I reading here now? What's happening? Recent British writers of historical mystery novels, not the generation of Ellis Peters, actually integrate this attitude into their plots. And as a result, all of a sudden, medieval crime and sex look very modern. And I will give you one example. Did you know that in the Middle Ages, sex was conducted with people dressed? No. But in these mystery novels, they're all naked, even if it's London in a cold January with no central heating in any room. But that was not the case. People were dressed. And we have some very interesting descriptions of sexual scenes in Byzantine literature, where it is made clear from point zero that the undressing of the characters goes up to their underwear, and there it stops. So our idea of steamy representation of sexual scenes in the movies does not reflect the Byzantine and generally medieval practice. So here again, I chose a different path. Instead of inventing, first of all, crimes of my own, I created them out of the material offered by the Byzantine sources. I took as my starting point the penal chapters of law collections and the surviving collections of judicial decisions. For example, in representing the crimes in the Ebony Lute, and the respective punishments Leo allots to each of the perpetrators in the form of the judge, because in the Ebony Lute, there is no judge in the city, and Leo, as the chief secretary, as the senior secretary of the chancellery, takes on this judicial role. So he becomes both the detective and the judge at the end. And I further used stories of crime and lust reported in historical and hagiographical works of the period, of which there are masses, but they have not been studied properly because Byzantium is seen as a pious society. So theoretically no sex, but that is of course not the case at all. I also copied acts of violence depicted in illuminated manuscripts, like for example this dare I say, superb flogging scene that I used in the opening chapter of the Bronze Eye. As strange as some of these crimes or sexual behaviors in my novels might appear, they in fact reflect to a substantial extent the Byzantine criminal and sexual imaginaire. In this way, the plots are drawn from within Byzantine culture, and then partly shaped by the conventions of the genre. In order to give depth to this perspective from within, I have presented the plots through Byzantine narrative techniques. Let me mention just one example. All three of my novels begin with what the Byzantines called an ekphrasis. This is an ancient rhetorical term used by the Byzantines to characterize a fully developed narrative description of a large painting, painting in quotation marks, because it can be the description of a person, it can be the description of a city, it can be the description of a landscape, yes? So the huge execution scaffold with mutilated corpses in the middle of an arid Anatolian plain seen by Leo in the Ebony Lute is just such an ekphrasis. The marketplace of Thessaloniki, seen through the eyes of the old stylite monk who is perched on his column and he looks down into the marketplace and what is happening, is another one. And finally, a black warship crossing the Aegean on an autumn evening before a storm, as described by the third-person narrator. And you have this. For most readers, the narrator's perspective in describing these paintings resembles that of a film camera. And so, the Byzantine rhetorical technique of enargia, which we can translate as translucent discourse or representation of vividness, is perceived as something very modern, but it is not, and didn't need a camera to be made. This is the interesting thing. And this is what was called mimesis, imitation. This term, mimesis, referred to a complex system of recreating the literary devices and the rhetorical style, but not necessarily the actual words, of a specific older author. So, beyond stylistics, I also applied mimesis to the narrative structure of my novels. Each one of them imitates, would the Byzantines say, and we today would say converses with, the structural techniques of a different 20th century mystery author. So Robert van Gulik and his Chinese historical novels with their intertwined plots in the Ebony Lute. The urban, slow-paced novels of P.D. James in The Bronze Eye, and Agatha Christie's Remote Place and Many Suspects riddle plot in The Enamel Medusa. For those readers who know the mystery genre and its variations, there is an added pleasure in discovering the imitative dialogue, sometimes subversive, that takes place between my novels and those of illustrious predecessors. So, for example, the Chinese plot structure in The Ebony Lute is hinted at by the presence of a young woman in the novel who is taken to be Chinese and is dressed up exactly like the attractive and often good-hearted whores in Van Gulik's novels, because many of his novels are acted out in contexts of brothels. This is a typical Byzantine attitude to literary composition, namely to present the readers with the tools of imitation and the product of imitation, and that this is judged positively and is made into a pleasurable game between author, text, and the imitated older model. But let us return to history and talk about the representation of the past. The professional Byzantinist has selected all the necessary material from his scientific laboratory to construct his Byzantine mystery novels, giving, or so he thinks, an authentic flavor to the plots. But is what the reader sees the real Byzantium of the 9th century? We should be reminded that it is practically impossible to reconstitute even the early years of our own lives as a narrative, much less to reconstruct a past age in its totality. And this is so because we rely in our comprehension of the past on memory and order. Memory operates through a complex system of selection. We choose the things that we wish to remember or to forget, while order imposes on the selected material that our mind has made a sort of uniformity and coherence that the past does not have and never had. Because history is more of a layered coexistence of disorderly discontinuities, so things happening at the same time but not necessarily in a causal connection, rather than a flowing progression of orderly continuities all the time. And you can think about that if you stop for a moment one evening and contemplate what happened on the previous day in your life. You, your family, neighbors, friends, the boss, the work, going at the supermarket, doing something, and then trying to put that into some kind of order, and you will immediately realize that you forget something, you've left something out, and that you have given shape into situations that actually take place at the same time. That's what memory and order does. But it makes for good storytelling, okay? In this sense, my writing resembles the forging of old paintings. I collected all the authentic source material through my professional knowledge, but I have put it together according to interpretative perspectives of the age in which I belong. Thus, I have woven into the plots such issues as psychological character formation, the construction of social roles and gender issues, sexuality and interpersonal relations, representations of alterity and deviation, finally, criticism of institutions and sociopolitical corruption. The military plays an important part in my novels, and it could be not otherwise in a society that is extremely strongly based on its military power and forces. So, how does one represent the army? A typical Byzantine military illustration showing a group of warriors on the move looks like the one we find in the famous Madrid Skilitsis Codex from the late 12th century. Right? And there you have a depiction of a group of cavalrymen that follow their general into battle. But, in my opinion, this is not visually inspiring. You can not make a good image out of that for a novel. So, for the visual aspect of my novels, and especially the Ebony Lute, I chose to use the cinematic techniques of Akira Kurosawa. Many of his most famous movies take place in Japan of the 16th century, an age of brutal civil strife and clashes between the samurai feudal world and a new military order, such as The Throne of Blood and Rebellion, adaptations of Shakespeare's Macbeth and King Lear, respectively, into the Japanese history. Kurosawa's approach to history was modernist and archaic at the same time, as he used the archaic worlds of Shakespearean mythical tragedy for his plots and medieval Japanese kabuki plays for his aesthetics, while employing cinematic devices developed by American Western and gangster movies. So, this scene coming from the Throne of Blood, and it's the army of Macbeth approaching the castle, the famous castle, is the inspiration for the scene in the Ebony Lute where the commander of the military camp outside Caesarea appears to the embassy from the mist of the Anatolian plain, and this aesthetic impression is far more stronger for me than the depiction on the Byzantine manuscript. So, to finish, what to a certain extent I attempted to create in my own Byzantine mystery stories is a narrative painting of history that is both forged and true. Forged in that it never existed as such, true in that it is a conscious reinterpretation of the past via the present, as well as it is an artistic dialogue with past and present stories, memories, and images along the path of a blood-stained narrative. To phrase it concisely, postmodern literary fabrication is the prerequisite for Byzantine fictional truth. Thank you. And
well,
this is a painting by a friend of mine, the acknowledged Greek painter Lida Papakonstantinou, which she calls a votive panel of 2008, where you see exactly this kind of connection between strange parts. It's a piece of cloth, and on the piece of cloth there are stitched all kinds of different things, including airplanes, and in the middle there is this print of a still life scene. And this painting inspired the painting that the young woman painter witch in the Enemo Medusa is actually having in her studio, and which Leo looks at and tries to interpret. That is what I mean, the connection between the contemporary world and the past in Byzantium.
Thank you so much. We will open it to the audience if there's questions. Do we pass? I can pass my mic.
I'm very interested in how long does it take you to write the novel, and what comes first? Do you start with just the plot, and then you add the historical research, or you have the historical facts already? Like, how does it work for you?
Well, the first thing that I chose when I decided that I came up with this idea was that the novels will take place in the early 9th century. That was my first instinctive reaction. And that the detective would be called Leo. And from that thing, I started developing ideas for crimes by looking at the legal connections and the material. And then gradually tried to develop the life of Leo. How long does he live? What is his career, his family, and so on and so forth. And then tried to put in this fictive biography the stories that would take place at different places and what possibilities one would have in order to show to readers the variety of sex. So like something certainly in Asia Minor, because it was the central lands of the empire, all right, the Romania, but then also the western parts of the empire, to which also Greece, I mean modern Greece, belongs. Then they were called Grecia. We tend to forget that the empire was not called Romania. It was called Romania, was its eastern parts, Grecia, its western parts. I liked the idea of having Leo somehow coming into or dealing with the sea by going to an island or so. And out of this general framework, then, I developed the individual plots, not the plots completely, but just the basic ideas. And the basic idea is always the crime, because it's the first thing that you need to catch. What will the crime be in order then to develop it? And then I started the research. So looking into for each region, what it had, what was its history. So Skyros, for example, the island of Skyros, I picked it up after having looked at a number of islands that could have been possible candidates for Leo to go to. And I chose Skyros because I discovered, I did not know that through the reading in the sources, that Skyros at exactly that time, the first half of the 9th century, was a place of political exile. And so there is a person who is a political exile on the island and whom Leo confronts, arriving there, not wanting to arrive there, because he's been doing a completely different job, and it's the storm in the sea that brings the boat to the warship to Skyros, and then he's confronted with this crazy island and the things that are happening there.
Cody?
Okay, that works. So I was wondering what your process is for authentically recreating the landscapes, which we don't really have a good archaeological record, such as Caesarea in Anatolia. Like, how do you build this city through imagery within the story, and how do you think it's reliable? How do you create a scene which we don't really know that much about?
This can be done in two ways. The case of Caesarea includes both ways. The one way is to be completely inventive and ignore any kind of historical connection. The other is to reconstruct the setting, for example, the city of Caesarea, through reflection, the mirroring, namely by using evidence of other cities and then the geographical setting, because the geographical setting remains the same. You have the river, you have the plain, you have the mountain, and then on the basis of that, you reconstruct something of which you pick something from Sardis, something from Ephesus, something from Alexandria, and you downscale it massively, and you end up with a generic Byzantine city in the process of being rebuilt because it is half destroyed. I mean, we know that Caesarea suffered heavily during the 8th century. So in the 9th century it is being, and that's what Leo sees. He sees half of the city is not built, the other half is built. There are many ruins around, and this is part of the process. So that's what you have. And because I did that in the Ebony Lute, I chose Thessaloniki as the city where I wanted to put the urban story, because that city we have, and that city we have the archaeological evidence and the research to do so. In the case of Skyros, I did it the other way around. And I've never been to Caesarea in Cappadocia, so I've never seen these places. So also the landscape is not in any kind of way my own experience of it. In the case of Skyros, I actually went and stayed for a whole week in Skyros, wandering and walking through the island and seeing its every single place, and accompanied by the a representative of the Byzantine ephorate of archaeological, of the Ministry of Culture, in order for him to explain certain things to me which I needed to understand. And that is why then I chose, and I actually did that at exactly the time when the novel was supposed to take place. So end of October, beginning of November. And because I'm not a photographer, I don't take photos. And my wife always complains because I can not even take her own portrait. I mean, it's always shaky. I actually walked through the island with a notebook, and every single landscape I saw and I thought was interesting, the trees, the animals, the color of the sea, the storm that I witnessed on the island, I actually wrote them down in the process of the making, and then these I used directly as my experiences in the novel itself. And that's why people in Skyros, when they discovered the novel, they totally freaked out because they recognized every single point of the island. And then they invited me to come to the island and give a talk and get into that and so on. So that's the way in which I do that, which of course is part of the forging, right?
First of all, I'm so sorry that we didn't get to be, what do they call it? Related.
Yeah, well, who knows?
I'm so sorry to hear that.
Maybe 10 generations before it might be possible, yeah.
Secondly, I love mystery novels, and I really thank you for giving us such a great insight into how you did write your mystery novels. I thank you for that. It's very, very interesting. Thank you.
What do you like more, the American or the British type?
Oh, anything I
Anything,
can get my hands on.
as long as there is a lot of
Yes.
murder and mystery involved.
Exactly. Thank you.
Actually, yesterday, which was Memorial Day, and therefore half of the city was closed, and there was a parade and so on, I took a walk and hit upon this very fine and fantastic old bookstore, MacLeod's, just here back around the corner. And I walked in and looked at stuff and so on, and then I asked the owner, who was very knowledgeable, if he had to recommend some Canadian crime fiction for me. And he looked and said, "What do you mean, Canadian? We have Vancouver crime." And so I picked up 2 novels now, which I'm going to read on the airplane, with Vancouver crime, one from the early 90s and one very recent from 2015. So right? That's a very interesting experience for me to see how Vancouver is being constructed in crime.
My question's twofold. First, you mentioned this whole, why do we create or depict gods, and then with like the art that's created with people's hands, why do we like praise it? Did you come with like a concise answer to that? And then the second part of my question is, you mentioned you have like an interest in sex, and I'm curious for people who or like that's something that you mentioned got you into, like it's been a little bit of theme sprinkled here and there. I'm curious, how do you think people who were religious in the Byzantine Empire, how are their like mindsets impacted like by religion, and then like were they sexually repressed, do you think, or were they free? Sorry, those are my 2 questions.
They are both very important questions for writing a crime novel, right? Especially if you want to have, and you must have, crime that can be related to love, jealousy, hatred in sexual relationships, or all sorts of things. Well, you know, piousness and religiosity, in whatever form it appears, is in general not a hindrance to sexual activity and desire. And the corrective measure for that is not to look at the religion's prohibitions to sexual behavior, starting with the 10 Commandments of Jewish tradition, right? One of the most important one is do not commit adultery, right? But to look at the law collections, because the law collections are not theoretical handbooks and guides. They present laws to regulate problems of a society at a specific moment. So when you have a law collection that emphatically, and I mean that, emphatically forbids sexual intercourse with animals, and you think, what are we talking here about? How is this possible? Because the first reaction is, you know, the emperor, and they present this kind of thing. And then you step for a moment back and you look at Byzantine society of the 8th century, where this collection was promulgated. It's the famous ecloga of Emperor Leo III. You realize that, yes, in a society that is primarily an agricultural society, and where men as shepherds were tending their cattle alone for months, sexual activity with animals was very frequent. No religious element involved there, right? So, I am not as much interested in sex per se, but I'm interested in the way that people's sexuality was represented handled and negotiated in another culture. And Byzantine culture is for us another culture. It is not our own. We see it from the outside. And that is fascinating because when reading the sources and the material, you come to realize that I wouldn't say that people behaved in exactly the same way like we do, because you used the word free. So the notion, of course, is for us, what does free sexual activity mean? Usually it means that there are no laws restricting the sexual activity per se. Like, for example, laws forbidding and punishing homosexual activities, sexual activities. But this does not mean that this was not carried out. And it was carried out. And the way in which you can see that it was carried out is not only because many sources at many different times describe such sexual activities, but because certain types of sexual crimes are repeated again and again in the book, the law collections, whereas others are dropped, which means that the lawgiver focuses on what happens to be practiced more or less at his time, usually with a restrictive, prohibitive, and conservative attitude, because the lawmaker in general tries to preserve what he thinks is the traditions of a society, but at the same time is forced to change and adjust because the society's traditions change. So let me give you a typical example. In the Corpus Juris Civilis, which is the huge law collection of Emperor Justinian I in the 6th century, adultery in all of its forms is automatically punished by death. Period. No distinction made. In the legal collection of Emperor Leo III, promulgated in 740, and we are talking so now about 220 years after the Justinianic law collection, the punishment of adultery changes substantially. There are clear distinctions made between if the two persons involved are both married, if only the man is married, if only the woman is married, if none of the two is married. And is that adultery, or in what form? And according, the punishments are decidedly less strong. There is no single case of the capital punishment being used for adultery, which means, well, there are other punishments, of course, but I mean bodily punishments, but death not. So that is a very interesting thing. You can see that the lawgiver decides that it is time to change what is actually a practice, and instead of prohibiting it generally, to clarify it, to specify it, and to allow the judge and the court to be flexible, because that is usually the case. Whereas if you have a law saying any adultery is punished with death, there is no flexibility. And this is very good when you study that for crime fiction, because you then can use that. So Leo in the Ebony Lute takes a little personal revenge on his secretary, whom he detests because he is, a big-mouthed, kind of stupid guy, by punishing him with one of the milder forms of adultery, because he catches him with the Chinese whore in bed, and he's married. So by punishing him for adultery with 12 lashes, whip lashes, he completely deconstructs or collapses the respectability of the person. He doesn't kill him, and he sends him home and gets rid of him. Okay? So he uses this device, the legal device, to make this little personal revenge. And that's what I was saying before, that Leo comes to recognize that he has a darker part of his personality, that he actually takes revenge on someone, though religion does not promote revenge, but love and forgiveness. Okay? Yeah.
Sam?
Yeah, I was wondering what you thought the pedagogical uses of such historical fictions would be, because you go through a lot of effort to make sure that the history in them is represented correctly, but also with the literary devices or the rhetorical devices you use, which can be quite complex to understand if you just read an academic article, but if in a classroom setting or wherever they're presented in this way, for example, the freedom with which you can use ekphrasis and mimesis and all of those things can be more easily accessed by a broader audience. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about using such novels as a pedagogical tool. Yeah.
To be honest, actually, I did not. I mean, I didn't start out by thinking in that way, simply because I didn't think of anything. I just started writing it and seeing if something will come out of it that was readable, given that I had never written a single line of fiction in my life, or prose. So, and I started at a relatively late age. So I finished my first novel in 2003, and I was 44 years old. So I didn't start as a young kind of writer. However, the truth is that in Greece, due to a reform that took place in school education sometime in exactly those years, around the year 2000 or so, teachers of literature and history were given the possibility of choosing books to read with the pupils in school that were not part of the actual official reading list, in order to support their knowledge of literature, modern Greek literature, or history. So actually, I got a number of teachers from high schools in Greece writing to me and asking me if it would be okay to use one of the novels for their history course or for their literature course. And I told them, you don't have to ask me. You can do anything you want. And in one case, they were so enthusiastic, and I told them, but you cannot give that to kids that are younger than 14 years. I mean, because, there's a lot of violence and scenes, and even if sex is not explicitly described, still, you cannot give it to a 12-year-old, I think. And they said, yeah, I don't know. In any case, then one teacher and her class from the city of Yanina in Epirus, they got totally into this thing, and they insisted of me going to visit them and meet them and ask their, respond to their questions after they had read The Bronze Eye. Because a number of them had families in Thessaloniki, they had been visiting Thessaloniki from Yanina, and so on and so forth. And I actually went. I said, oh, okay, guys, I'll come. I have my wife is in Thessaloniki, I'll do it. And I went, and it was an amazing experience, because we went out of the school and we sat at a cafe and talked for a whole afternoon, and they came up with amazing remarks and questions about all kinds of things. And I thought that was extremely pedagogical for them. But it's not something that you kind of institutionalize. What I have done, what I did at the University of Cyprus is that I gave a course on crime novels for the broader student community, not as part of the specific undergraduate program of the Department of Byzantine and Modern Greek Studies. And 1 week was dedicated to Greek novel writing, and 1 week was dedicated to historical crime fiction. So we read a Van Gulik novel, and we read an Ellis Peters novel, and then I threw one of my novels to them. And that was very interesting because they kind of reacted to the fact that their teacher was actually the author of the novel. So what's happening there, this guy, is he actually like the characters of, so they came up and asked me, you're such a nice person with a lot of humor. How did you think about all of these deaths and killing people, and how does that go, and what is this all about? And they were not literature students. They were students from other departments, like physics and economics and political sciences and marketing, this kind of thing. So they were not, that their relation to literature was kind of raw. But this raw element brought out, some very interesting thoughts. So I thought, why don't I actually invite one or two of the Greek authors, have them, read one of their contemporary novels, and talk to the authors. And that was a huge success because they loved it. Especially because a lot of kids in Cyprus, their parents and themselves, they often go to Athens or to Thessaloniki to spend weekends there and do shopping and have the experience of the big cities, go to places to listen to bouzouki music and singers that they like and so on and so forth, which they don't have in Cyprus. So suddenly they were confronted with novels representing Athens as the space of crime in a very brutal form that was totally contrary to their idealized idea and image of the city of Athens. And then they actually met the author, and I had both Petros Markaris and Andreas Apostolidis come, and for them that was a very big pedagogical experience on that level. And I think that is the great advantage of teaching modern literature, because for better or for worse, we cannot invite Psellos to our class. I mean, he's dead 1,000 years now. So there's no way that we can interact with a Byzantine writer. So it's us that we play his voice in a kind of way. And that is very nice. It was for me also a very rewarding experience, because it was something completely different than my usual kind of teaching experience. As much as I am passionate about Byzantine texts, this kind of experience, to have the students talking to the author whose city and idealized love, be it Athens or Thessaloniki, is being deconstructed in their novels, was very interesting. To give you an example, I had these two young women. They were from the city of Limassol, which is it's a harbor city in Cyprus, and very famous for it being an open society and not at all conservative like the rest of Cyprus, and with all things happening there, and previously a very big and very rich Arabic community, and then a Russian community. So these two young women, interestingly, both in the Department of Economics, totally very intelligent, about 20 years old. And we read Andreas Apostolidis' superb but brutal novel called, the title alone is indicative, Lobotomy. Okay? And it's about Athens and the crime scene at the turn of the century, the celebration of the millennium in 2000. And both of them, their fathers, were in the Cypriot police force. And they were both shocked by the representation of police violence and police corruption by the Greek author concerning the Greek police force. And they expressed very openly their objection to this representation, saying, our dads, they're not at all like that, and blah, blah. And they became very emotional. And I told them, have you actually talked with your dads about their jobs, what they are actually doing? And then they stopped and said, no, because our dads do not talk to us about that. And that's right, I said to them, because it's not for you to know what exactly they are doing in the police force, because you have to be protected. But at some point, you should actually have this conversation with them, and maybe they will allow themselves to tell you a few things about what they see in their job. And they were totally on it. And they obviously went back home to Limassol, talked to their parents, confronted them with this thing, and their dads talked to them a little bit about that. And then they came back and said, well, they said to us a few things that seem to make what's being represented in the novel not totally unreal. And that was for them quite a pedagogical experience.
So mindful of time, of our speakers' commitment to our edification and work in that direction, I'd like to reflect on one thing as we conclude, to go back to Sam's fascination with the rhetorical devices and exercises. Byzantium is stereotypically seen as a society of sclerosis and often stale imitation of a classical canon. Very often Byzantium is looked at as this fridge where we put texts. They kept it running so that we in the modern era could kind of interpret it. What I think has been truly fascinating in your work is the emergence out of the pages of the novels of a Byzantium that is by no means that, and what that is vibrant, that is disjunctive from these narratives, truly alive and always dealing with its contradictions. And what I especially appreciated with this breakdown of the rhetorical techniques is the element of originality and creativity that can come out of the utilization of tradition and the reworking of tradition and method that in so many ways can be so characteristic of Byzantium without making it stale, without making it something that we often, even in our classes, have to apologize for. I'm so thankful that you took the invitation and you joined us. And I'm so thankful for a wonderful presentation. Thank you to our audience who braved inclement weather and came to join us. And I want to ask you all to keep looking at our media, advertisements and information for more events. There is more coming this month. As they say these days, and it's not the best thing to say, do your research, your own research, and come back to us. Thank you, and thank you for being here tonight.